What is going on, everybody? Today, we have a story that anyone who has ever worked a real job and watched someone else take the credit is going to feel deep in their chest. A guy spends 12 years working his way up in his father's commercial building services company, learns the business from the ground up, runs crews, handles permits, manages projects, earns every inch of his position. Then his father retires and hands 60% ownership to, wait for it, the brother-in-law. A guy who married into the family 5 years earlier. Why? Because he has a family to support. Our guy keeps working, keeps his head down, and watches as the brother-in-law systematically destroys the company from the inside. Cheap materials, off-the-books workers, inflated invoices, phantom expenses. But our guy, he's been keeping copies of the real books. When a building inspector flags shoddy work on a commercial project, the state steps in, and everything the brother-in-law built on lies comes crashing down. Federal charges, a ruined pension, and a quiet guy with a filing cabinet full of truth. Let's get into it. I spent 12 years in my father's company. He gave my brother-in-law 60% ownership when he retired. The BIL ran a fraud operation. I kept copies of the real books. Now he's facing federal charges. I want to preface this by saying I don't enjoy any of what happened. People think stories like this end with the good guy popping champagne and doing a victory lap. They don't. They end with family dinners that don't happen anymore, a father who won't return your calls, and a sister who looks at you like you burned down her house. Which, in a way, I guess I did. Just not the way she thinks. My name's Cole. I'm 36. For 12 years, I worked in my father's company, Beckett Commercial Services. We did commercial renovation and building maintenance, office build-outs, retail space overhauls, facility upgrades, that kind of thing. My dad, Warren Beckett, started the company in 1997 out of a rented garage with one employee, himself. By the time I joined at 24, he had a team of about 15, a decent client list, and a reputation in the region for doing clean, honest work. Not the cheapest, not the flashiest. But if Warren Beckett's name was on a project, the work was solid. I want to make sure I describe what I actually did there because it matters later. I started at the bottom. Literally the bottom. My first 2 years I was doing material runs, cleaning up job sites, organizing the supply warehouse, and learning how to read permits and spec sheets. My dad didn't give me a shortcut because I was his son. He gave me a longer path. He used to say, if you can't explain every line on a materials invoice, you've got no business signing one. So I learned every line. I learned how to estimate a job, how to schedule crews, how to deal with inspectors, how to handle the inevitable moment when a client changes their mind about a wall color at 4:30 on a Friday and wants it fixed by Monday. That happened more than you'd think. People are very emotional about paint colors. By year 5, I was a project supervisor. By year 8, I was running the day-to-day operations, scheduling, vendor relationships, payroll coordination, quality checks. My dad handled the business side, the bids, the accounting, the client meetings. But by year 10, I was sitting in on those too. Not because he invited me, because I asked. I wanted to understand the whole picture. I figured someday the company would be mine, or at least mostly mine. Not because I was entitled to it, because I'd earned it. 12 years of showing up before sunrise and leaving after dark. 12 years of solving problems nobody else wanted to touch. I didn't take vacations. I didn't call in sick. I was there. I want to give one example of what being there looked like, because I think people hear 12 years and think of it as a number. It's not a number. It's a life. When I was 27, we were doing a full floor renovation for an insurance company. Mid-project, the client's fire suppression system failed during testing and flooded about 3,000 square feet of freshly installed flooring. It was a Saturday. Nobody was on site except me because I'd come in to double-check the electrical layout. I called my dad. He was at my niece's birthday party. Laura's first kid had just turned 1. He said he'd come in Monday. I spent the next 11 hours coordinating with the water remediation company, documenting the damage for the insurance claim, pulling up the compromised flooring to prevent mold, and calling our material supplier to arrange an emergency reorder. By Monday morning, when my dad walked in, the damaged section was already gutted, and the replacement materials were in the warehouse. He looked at me and said, "Good man." That was it. But from him, that was everything. I should mention I also have a sister. Her name's Laura. Laura is 3 years older than me and married a guy named Greg Haynes about 7 years ago. Greg is, and I want to be fair here, but I also want to be accurate, the kind of guy who always has a better idea. Every conversation, every topic, every decision, Greg has a shortcut, a workaround. A guy he knows who can get it done cheaper or faster or both. He's charming about it, I'll give him that. He's got this salesman energy where he makes you feel like you're the smart one for agreeing with him. My dad loved it, called Greg a real go-getter. My mom thought he was wonderful because he always complimented her cooking and remembered her birthday. Laura adored him because honestly, Greg can be very likable when things are going his way. I called Greg the shortcut king, not to his face, just in my head. Because everything Greg touched had a shortcut attached to it. He didn't want to learn the process. He wanted to skip the process and get to the result. And for a while, in small doses, that looked like efficiency. It looked like ambition. It wasn't until he got his hands on the whole company that I realized it was something else entirely. Greg came into Beckett Commercial Services about 5 years before my dad retired. He didn't start at the bottom like I did. My dad brought him in as a business development associate, which was a title Greg probably suggested himself. His job was supposed to be finding new clients and bringing in new projects. And he did bring in some work, mostly through a combination of lowball bids and personal connections. The bids were almost always too low, which meant the margins were thin, which meant corners had to be trimmed to make the numbers work. I raised this concern with my dad multiple times. My dad said, "Greg's just aggressive. He'll learn the balance." He didn't learn the balance. But anyway, we were a family business and Greg was family, so I kept my mouth shut and did my job. I figured when my dad retired, we'd work it out. I had 12 years of experience. I knew the clients, the crews, the vendors, the inspectors. I knew where every pipe ran and every wire connected. Greg had 5 years of schmoozing and a Rolodex. I wasn't worried. I should have been worried. All right, pause. This is me, not Cole. Cole spent 12 years learning every inch of his father's company, bottom to top. Material runs to daily operations. And his brother-in-law Greg, a guy who married in and got a custom job title, has been there 5 years doing what? Lowballing bids and shaking hands at lunch? This is like watching someone build a house brick by brick while another guy leans against the wall and says, "I helped." I'm calling Greg the shortcut king because Cole's too polite about it. This man doesn't cut corners. He eliminates geometry entirely. And what happens when Dad retires? Oh, just wait. My dad announced his retirement on a Thursday. I remember it was a Thursday because we had a standing crew meeting every Thursday morning at 7, and he walked in wearing a collared shirt instead of his usual work jacket, which was the first sign something was different. The second sign was that Greg was already there. Greg never came to the Thursday meetings. My dad gave a short speech. 28 years of building Beckett Commercial Services. Proud of what we'd accomplished. Time to step back and enjoy life. My mom's health had been a concern. She'd had a knee replacement the year before, and the recovery was slow, and he wanted to be home more. All of that made sense. I was happy for him, genuinely. The man had worked hard his entire life and he deserved rest. Then he got to the ownership part. He said he'd been thinking about it for a long time. He said the company needed strong leadership going forward. He said he was splitting ownership between me and Greg. I was getting 40%. Greg was getting 60%. I didn't react. Not visibly. I've always been like that. I process things internally before I respond externally. My face does one thing while my brain does another. So I sat there and I nodded and I listened while my dad explained that Greg had a growing family to support. Laura was pregnant with their second kid at the time. And that the 60-40 split reflected the direction the company needed to go. Greg was going to handle operations and business development. I was going to continue as project supervisor. Continue as project supervisor. The role I'd been in for 7 years. No promotion, no expanded authority, just continue. I mean, look, I understood the family reasoning. Greg had 2 kids, I was single, no dependents. In my dad's mind, the math was simple. Greg needs more, so Greg gets more. It didn't matter that I'd been there 12 years to Greg's 5. It didn't matter that I could walk onto any job site and know instantly if something was wrong. It didn't matter that I'd turned down 2 job offers from competitors because I believed this company would be mine. None of that mattered because Greg had a family photo on his desk and I had a coffee mug. After the meeting, my dad pulled me aside. He put his hand on my shoulder, that thing dads do when they're about to say something they know you don't want to hear, and said, "Cole, you understand, right? Greg needs this. You're strong. You'll be fine." There it was again. That word. Fine. The word people use when they don't want to think too hard about whether you actually are. I told him I understood. And I did. I understood perfectly. I just didn't agree. I want to mention something that has nothing to do with the rest of this story, but I think about it sometimes. The day my dad announced his retirement, I drove home and stopped at a gas station to fill up. There was a woman at the next pump struggling with the gas cap on her car. It was one of those older models where the cap sticks. I walked over and opened it for her. She said thanks, and then she said, "You look like you're having a rough day." I told her I was fine. She said, "Nobody who says fine that fast is actually fine." I laughed. She laughed. She drove away. I never saw her again. But I think about that interaction a lot because a stranger at a gas station read me better in 10 seconds than my own father did in 12 years. Anyway, hold on. Let me jump in with a hypothetical. Imagine you're playing a video game. 12 years of grinding. Every side quest done. Every stat maxed. Map memorized. Then the developer logs in, looks at your account and your buddies, the guy who joined 5 years ago and mostly hangs out in the lobby, and says, "We're giving him admin access and 60% of the loot because he's got more characters to feed." Your reward for 12 years? Keep playing. Same role. Same level. Under the guy who skipped the tutorial. That's not a retirement plan. That's a betrayal with a benefits package. And Cole is doing a lot of internal processing right now. I stayed at Beckett Commercial Services for 14 months after my dad retired. I want to be very specific about what I saw during those 14 months because it matters for what comes later. The first thing Greg did, and I mean within the first 2 weeks, was change vendors. We had long-standing relationships with suppliers my dad had used for years. Good materials, fair pricing, reliable delivery. Greg replaced 3 of our primary suppliers with companies I'd never heard of. When I asked why, he said, "Better rates." The rates were better. The materials were not. I could tell the difference immediately. Cheaper fasteners, lower grade finishes, substitute products that looked similar on paper but didn't perform the same in practice. On a small residential job, maybe nobody notices. On a commercial project with inspectors and code requirements, it's a different story. I raised the issue. Greg said I was overthinking it. He said the clients wouldn't know the difference. He said, "We're not building rocket ships here, Cole." That became his favorite phrase. Every time I flagged a concern about materials, about timelines, about staffing, he'd say, "We're not building rocket ships." As if the standard for quality was simply, it didn't explode. The second thing was the crews. My dad had always used documented workers. Everyone on payroll, everyone insured, everything above board. It was more expensive, sure, but it meant we were covered if anything went wrong. Injury, liability, audit, whatever. Greg started bringing in crews that weren't on our payroll. Cash workers. No documentation, no insurance, no workers' comp. I found out about it when I showed up to a commercial renovation downtown, a 3-story office building we were overhauling for a property management group, and found 8 guys on site that I'd never met. They weren't in our system. They didn't have company badges. When I asked the site lead who they were, he said, "Greg sent them." I went to Greg. He told me he was supplementing the team with independent help to keep costs down. I asked if they were insured. He said, "They're independent, so that's on them." That's not how it works. On a commercial site, the general contractor is responsible for everyone working under their scope. If one of those guys falls off a scaffold and he's not in our insurance, we're exposed. Massively exposed. I explained this to Greg. He told me to relax. He told me he had it handled. He told me, and I remember this exact phrase, "You worry about the walls, I'll worry about the wallet." The third thing was the invoices. And this is where it gets serious. I handled a lot of the project paperwork, materials orders, delivery confirmations, change orders, that kind of thing. About 4 months after Greg took over, I noticed discrepancies between the invoices we were submitting to clients and the actual cost of the projects. Specifically, the invoices were higher. Not slightly higher. Significantly higher. Materials that cost $8,000 were billed at $12. Crew hours that totaled $200 were billed at $350. Line items for services that, as far as I could tell, were never performed. Phantom expenses, ghost labor. The numbers didn't match. I pulled the actual receipts. I pulled the supplier invoices. I pulled the timesheets from the crews I did manage. And I compared them, line by line, to the client invoices Greg was sending out. The gap was consistent. Every project was overbilled by somewhere between 15 and 35%. I didn't confront Greg right away. I know that sounds strange, but I needed to understand the full scope before I did anything. So I did what I've always done. I documented. For 3 months, I kept parallel records. The real books and Greg's books. Every receipt, every invoice, every timesheet. I saved copies of everything on a personal drive, not on company servers. A separate drive that I kept at my apartment. I made duplicates. I organized them by project number, by date, by vendor. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I just collected. I also discovered during this period that Greg was reporting fewer employees to the state than we actually had working on projects. The cash workers weren't just uninsured, they were invisible, which meant Greg wasn't paying payroll taxes on them, which meant the revenue from their labor was being reported without the corresponding labor costs, which is, to put it bluntly, fraud. I want to be clear about something. I didn't keep those records because I was planning revenge. I kept them because I knew, from 12 years of watching my dad run a clean operation, that what Greg was doing was going to catch up with him eventually. Inspectors talk. Clients compare notes. The state doesn't forget. I wanted to have the truth documented when that day came. Not for me, for my dad's company. For the name Beckett, which still meant something to me even if it didn't seem to mean much to Greg. All right, let me cut in with a psychological read. 2 types of people in a crisis. The type who panics and fights the fire while it's a spark, and the type who quietly grabs a camera because they know the fire is coming whether they shout or not. Cole is the second type. He watched the Shortcut King inflate invoices, dodge taxes, and hire ghost crews. And instead of screaming, he built a shadow archive, receipt by receipt, invoice by invoice, for 3 months. That's not patience. That's someone who learned the right way from his father and knows exactly what the wrong way looks like. I left Beckett Commercial Services 14 months after Greg took majority control. I didn't quit in a dramatic fashion. I thought about it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't have a fantasy or two about walking into Greg's office and dropping a stack of receipts on his desk like a movie scene. But that's not me. I've never been the dramatic exit type. I gave 2 weeks' notice, trained my replacement, a younger guy named Dennis who seemed competent but had no idea what he was walking into, and I packed my desk. My desk, by the way, was the same one I'd used for 10 years. Oak top, 1 wobbly leg, a coffee stain shaped vaguely like the state of Ohio. I thought about taking the nameplate but decided against it. It felt too sentimental for a situation that required clear eyes. Greg didn't try to stop me. He seemed relieved, honestly. The guy who kept asking questions was finally leaving. His exact words were, "No hard feelings, right?" I told him no hard feelings, which was a lie, but a small one. I took a position with another firm across town. Better pay, fewer headaches, no brother-in-law. I liked it. I was good at it. And I tried very hard to not think about what was happening back at Beckett. But here's the thing about trying not to think about something. It doesn't work. Every time I drove past one of our old job sites, I'd wonder what was happening behind the walls we'd finished. Every time I heard someone mention Beckett's name in the industry, my ears would prick up like a dog hearing a can opener. I heard things too. Not from snooping, just from existing in the same professional circles. People talk. A vendor we'd used for years told me Greg had stopped paying invoices on time. A project manager at another firm mentioned that Beckett had underbid them on a government contract by an amount that didn't make mathematical sense. I filed all of it away in my head and kept moving. My dad called me a few times during this period. We'd talk about normal stuff, the weather, sports, my mom's knee, whatever. He never asked why I left. I think he knew on some level, but didn't want to hear it confirmed. Dads are like that sometimes. They can sense the truth in a room, but they'll rearrange the furniture around it rather than look at it directly. My sister Laura called once to say she thought it was a shame I'd left and that Greg was really trying. I said something polite and changed the subject. 7 months after I left, I got a call from Dennis, the replacement. He sounded stressed. He said a building inspector had flagged major issues on a commercial project, the 3-story office building I mentioned earlier. Substandard materials, code violations, structural concerns. The property management company that hired Beckett was furious. The city had issued a stop work order, and the inspector had referred the case to the state. I told Dennis I was sorry and that I couldn't help him from where I was. I wished him luck. And then I sat in my truck in the parking lot of my new office for about 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, thinking about what was coming. What was coming arrived about 3 months later. A state investigator called me, said she was looking into Beckett Commercial Services as part of a review triggered by the building inspection findings. She asked if I'd be willing to answer some questions. I said yes. She asked if I had any documentation related to the company's operations during the period I was employed there. I told her I had extensive records. There was a pause on the phone. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "How extensive?" I told her everything. The parallel books, the inflated invoices, the unreported workers, the phantom expenses, the gap between what was billed and what was real. I told her about the cash crews, the vendor switches, the material downgrades. I told her about the payroll discrepancies and the tax reporting gaps. I offered to provide all of it, organized, dated, cross-referenced. She asked me to come in. I came in the next day. I brought 2 banker's boxes and a flash drive. The investigator, a woman named Patricia, very calm, very precise, the kind of person who takes notes with a pen that probably costs more than my watch, spent 4 hours going through the files with me. She asked detailed questions. She took copies of everything. At one point, she stopped, looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, "You kept very thorough records." I told her my dad taught me that. She nodded and went back to the files. Those records became state evidence. The investigation expanded from there. The state brought in federal investigators because the tax issues crossed a threshold that made it a federal matter. I don't know all the details of what happened behind the scenes. I wasn't involved in the investigation itself, just the initial evidence handoff. But I know the broad strokes from what became public record and from what Dennis told me in a few phone calls before everything got too serious for casual updates. Greg was charged with multiple counts of tax fraud, filing false business records, and wage reporting violations. The inflated invoices weren't just overcharging clients. They were creating false revenue reports that didn't match the actual expenses, which meant the tax filings were fraudulent. The off-the-books workers weren't just an insurance liability. They were a tax evasion scheme. The state calculated that Greg had underreported payroll by somewhere in the range of $300,000 over a 2-year period. The federal charges related to the false tax returns filed during that same period. I want to pause here and say something about what it feels like to watch this happen to a company with your family's name on it. Because from the outside, it probably looks satisfying. Guy who wronged you gets caught. Justice, karma, whatever you want to call it. But it didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like watching a house fire, a house you grew up in, a house you helped build. And even though you didn't start the fire, and even though you warned people it was coming, you still have to stand there and watch it burn. And there's a part of you, a part you don't want to admit to, that thinks maybe if you'd grabbed the fire extinguisher instead of the camera, maybe you could have saved something. Maybe not, but maybe. And here's the part that still keeps me up at night. My dad's pension. When my dad retired, part of his arrangement was a deferred compensation plan tied to the company's ongoing performance and tax standing. Basically, the company was supposed to continue making contributions to a fund that would pay my dad a monthly amount during retirement. Greg stopped making those contributions almost immediately. He redirected the money. When the federal investigation hit, the company's accounts were frozen. The deferred compensation fund, what was left of it, was swept into the investigation. My dad's retirement income, the thing he'd spent 28 years building toward, was tangled up in Greg's fraud. My dad lost most of his pension. Not all of it. There were some protections, and his attorney managed to separate a portion of the funds from the company's liabilities. But the monthly amount he was supposed to receive for the rest of his life was cut by about 60%. The man who built Beckett Commercial Services from a rented garage, who never cut a corner, who taught me that integrity was the only thing a business really has. That man is now living on a fraction of what he earned because his son-in-law treated the company like a personal ATM. I haven't spoken to my dad in 5 months. The last time we talked, he said, "I trusted him, Cole. I trusted him and I trusted you." I asked what he meant by that. He said, "You could have told me before it got this bad. You could have come to me." And he hung up. That's the part people don't understand about stories like this. Everyone wants a clean ending. Hero wins, villain loses, justice is served, credits roll. But real life doesn't work like that. My dad blames Greg for what he did, but he also blames me for not stopping it sooner. And honestly, I don't know if he's wrong. I kept the records. I documented everything. But I didn't sound the alarm. I didn't go to my dad and say, "This is what's happening in your company." I told myself I was being strategic. I told myself the evidence would matter more than the warning. And maybe it did. The records became state evidence. They helped build a federal case. But they didn't save my dad's pension. And they definitely didn't save my relationship with my father. Laura doesn't speak to me. She blames me entirely, which I understand, even though I disagree. Her husband is facing federal charges. Her family is falling apart. She needs someone to blame who isn't Greg, because if she blames Greg, then she has to reckon with the fact that she married him. And that's a harder conversation than being angry at me. Greg's case is still working through the system. I don't know what the outcome will be. His attorney is apparently arguing that the billing discrepancies were accounting errors and that the cash workers were independent subcontractors, which is the legal equivalent of saying, "I didn't rob the bank, I just made an unauthorized withdrawal." I don't think it's going to work. The evidence is pretty clear. But I've learned that the legal system moves slowly and unpredictably, and I'm not going to predict outcomes. Beckett Commercial Services no longer exists as a functioning company. The contracts dried up after the stop work order went public. The remaining employees, the real ones, the documented ones, found other jobs. Dennis landed at a firm similar to mine. The company name, which my father spent 28 years building, is now associated with fraud and code violations. That's the legacy Greg left. As for me, I'm doing okay. I'm at the new firm. The work is good. I'm respected there in a way that I think I always was at Beckett, but never fully felt because the shadow of the boss's son followed me everywhere. Here, I'm just Cole. The guy who shows up early, stays late, and catches things other people miss. I like that version of myself better. I had a conversation with my boss at the new firm about a month ago. We were wrapping up a project review and she asked me how I ended up in this field. I gave her the short version. Grew up in the business, worked for my dad, moved on. She said, "Moved on from a family business? That's usually a story." I told her it was. She didn't press, but she said something that stuck with me. The people who leave family businesses are either the ones who couldn't hack it or the ones who couldn't stand watching someone else not hack it. I didn't tell her which one I was. I think she already knew. I think about my dad a lot. I think about what I could have done differently. I think about whether I should have confronted Greg directly or gone to my dad sooner or called the state myself instead of waiting for an inspector to find the problems. I think about the gas station woman who told me nobody who says fine that fast is actually fine. I think about the fact that my dad gave 60% of his life's work to a man who dismantled it in 2 years, and that the 40% he gave me, the loyalty, the knowledge, the work ethic, turned out to be worth more than the other 60 ever was. And I think about the box of records sitting in my closet, the copies of the copies, the real books, the ones that showed what actually happened versus what Greg wanted people to believe happened. I built that archive over 3 months, sitting at my kitchen table after work, organizing receipts and cross-referencing invoices. It was boring. It was tedious. It was the most important thing I've ever done. And I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because my dad taught me that the numbers should always tell the truth, even when the people don't. I just wish the truth hadn't cost him so much. And there it is. Cole spent 12 years learning integrity from a man who built a company on it. Then, he watched the Shortcut King burn it down in under 2 years. Greg didn't just cheat the numbers. He cheated the man who gave him the keys. And the quiet kid everybody assumed was fine turned out to be the only one keeping an honest count. The records are evidence. The company is gone. The pension is gutted. And the father who said, "You could have told me," doesn't realize his son did. Sometimes the loudest warning is the person who stops talking and starts writing things down. And that is where we'll leave it. Look, this one doesn't have a victory lap. There's no champagne moment. Cole did the right thing, kept the right records, and the truth came out. But the truth had collateral damage. A father's pension, a sister's marriage, a family that doesn't sit at the same table anymore. That's the thing about fraud. It doesn't just destroy the business. It destroys every relationship the business was built on. So here's my question for you guys, and I genuinely want to hear your answers on this one. If you were Cole, would you have gone to your father sooner with what you found, even knowing he might not have believed you and might have sided with Greg? Or would you have done what Cole did, kept quiet, kept the records, and let the system catch up on its own? Is there a version of this where Cole saves the company and keeps his family? Or was the damage done the moment his dad handed the keys to the wrong person? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if this one hit close to home, if you've ever watched someone who didn't earn it get handed something you built, I hear you. We all do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.